Hey, this is Mr. Mitchell with a new video. This particular video is about forces. Here are forces questions, and here is some info about force. Force is a push or pull. Anytime you change the motion of an object, you use a force. Let me say that again. Anytime you change the motion of an object, you use a force. So there's a lot of forces out there. Say you move your pencil from one side of your desk to the other. You've used force in which to do that. You put on your backpack. The gravity that pulls the backpack down as you are lifting it up is a force. Closing and opening your classroom door, you have to use force. But forces don't only come from you, they are acted upon you sometimes. We just mentioned gravity. Here we have this skater who has some kind of mass. Gravity is the attraction between two objects that have some kind of mass. And she weighs something. So the earth below weighs a lot, but still weighs, there's an attraction between her and the earth, and that's of course what keeps her grounded, you might say. But that is a force. There's also the force of friction. Now, you've heard of the term friction before. I just want to remind you. Friction is the force that resists motion between surfaces that are pressed together. And what you have pressed together here are the not blades, but I guess this would be the wheels of the skates and the earth. And what happens is, without friction, of course, she could just keep going forever. But there is that friction to where she will slow down and probably just several feet there. So she has to keep working to overcome that force of friction. But those are not the ones we're going to talk about the most. The ones we're going to talk about the most that is really kind of a heady subject is what's called contact force. I think I'll use a different color for contact force. Here the skater is. She is pushing down upon the ground. And in order for her to skate like that, she has to do, it's not all going to be forward. She has to push down on the ground and push off. But here's what scientists say happens. That there's another force. A force that the ground applies to her. She pushes on the ground pushes on her. It's kind of an equal and opposite force, and you'll hear those terms later on. But a contact force, you have the two forces that are against each other, and one pushes on each other. And here you are probably sitting at some kind of desk. Your elbow may be leaning on the desk. You're pushing on the desk. But the desk is also pushing back at you. And I know that's kind of a heady concept there. Oh, what a pitiful little table I just drew. But anyway, the force, you're pushing down on it, and it is pushing back up on you. I know that's kind of a stretch right there, but that's what scientists would say. Force, one other thing about force before we continue is force is a vector, which means it is like velocity and is like acceleration. It has direction, as you can see from the arrows. We've been talking about direction already. Think of a tug of war. In a tug of war, you have forces that are going in two different directions. You have one force that is pulling to the right, and one force that's pulling to the left. And they definitely have a direction. They definitely do. Now, they may not be moving much right here, but they definitely have a direction. You can predict an object's movement by knowing the forces on each side. Here it looks like we have 3 kids on one side and 3 kids on the other. If you had 6 kids on one side and 3 on the other, you could predict that the force would make it go this way. But with 3 and 3, and apparently about the same strength, you have zero movement. And it brings us up the term net force, and I think I might have it on this next page here. Yeah, net force. Net force is the total combined forces on an object. So whenever we were back here at the tug of war, we had the forces going one way, we had the forces going another way. We did have the force of gravity, which was pulling them down. I'm sure there's a potential for friction between the feet and the ground. So there were a lot of forces there, and there are going to be a lot of forces here. Here you've got this little car with these wheels. You know it would take nothing at all to just give it a little bit of nudge and off it would go. So you could create a force on one side. You could create a force on another side. You could even get a blow dryer and probably push this little car across. But you've also got friction. You've also got gravity, which are other forces. But whenever it is just sitting here, with the net forces equaling zero, I guess you might say, and it's not moving, you can say you have balanced forces. Now that's not to say there aren't forces on it. It's just saying that it's not creating the movement. They're all balanced out. Kind of like this tug of war. This tug of war, they're just staying there. They're not going one direction or the other. It's balanced. That's a lot of forces going on, but just not a lot of movement yet. So that is balanced forces. Now, inevitably, in that tug of war, one side will win. One side will win, and you will have an unbalanced force. Now, here's where I'm going to get to. Only an unbalanced force can change an object's motion. Think of all the motion that you can have. The moving of the pencil, running up and down a field, even this little car moving just a little bit. Every one of them has an unbalanced force that can change its object motion. An unbalanced force. So, can you have movement with balanced forces? You can, but it has to be movement of constant acceleration. You may remember from our first video, or I guess our last video, that we had a graph like this where you had constant acceleration. You had no acceleration, constant average speed, I guess is what I should say. But you had no acceleration, you had no deceleration. It's kind of like that tug of war. There is no change, constant speed. This little kid right here, if he stays at, say, 15 miles an hour the entire trip, he's at a constant speed, but you know that's not going to happen. So yes, you can have movement, but it has to be at constant average speed, and that's not going to happen that often. But you have to have an unbalanced force to have any kind of acceleration or deceleration. So constant velocity here, or the constant average speed, is an example of two balanced forces. The force you exert on a bicycle by going a constant speed balances out the forces of friction and the forces of gravity that would slow it down. But if this little kid accelerates or decelerates, it makes it an unbalanced force. And that brings us to Newton's first law of motion. We'll talk a little bit more about Isaac Newton later on, but I mean, here's his first law of motion. Objects at rest tend to stay at rest, and objects at motion tend to stay at motion. We're going to talk about how they are with balanced and unbalanced forces. Well, let's talk about the rule itself. Here's this little kid has a coin on top of a jar separated by a note card. He flicks the note card. What's going to happen to the coin? It will drop into the jar. Because this object at rest wants to stay at rest. It tends to stay at rest unless an unbalanced force is used upon it. And we'll get back to that. Objects in motion tend to stay in motion. Hey, this guy was going in motion, but he suddenly had to stop, or at least the bike stopped, because as a body that was in motion, he tended to want to stay in motion. So as a result, he goes flying, and I don't know if there's any protection over there or not. Maybe there is. Hope so, hope there is. But anyway, that is Newton's first law of motion. There is little difference between an object at rest and an object in constant velocity. So this coin that is just sitting there and this motorcycle, which may be going at constant velocity, they need an unbalanced force to make it move. And these tires were definitely an unbalanced force. And this cart is not going to be as much of an unbalanced force because it's not making it move. If he were to flick the coin, that would make it move, of course. They both continue until acted upon by an unbalanced force, whether it's going to be at rest or whether it's not going to be at rest. Let's take a look here. We've got this girl kicking a soccer ball. I think it's a girl kicking a soccer ball. Right now, the object, the soccer ball, is at rest. There's going to be a huge unbalanced force which is going to make it move. This object tends to stay at rest until acted upon by the unbalanced force. Then the ball is moving, and the ball will tend to want to move until acted upon by some unbalanced force, which in this case is his hands. His hands are stopping it. So here you have both parts of Newton's first law. The soccer ball wants to stay at rest, and then the soccer ball wants to keep going. And you have unbalanced forces that are created by the leg and by the guy stopping it. And I got a soccer ball that's a different one down here than up there. But oh well, you kind of get the point, I hope. See if I have caught up with my notes. We're to this point called inertia. Inertia goes hand in hand with Newton's first law. Inertia is the resistance of an object to change its speed or direction, just like we saw with the soccer ball, just like we saw with this coin right here. It's resisting change. Just like we saw with this guy here, it's resisting the stopping. It's resisting change. Now there's a little bit more to inertia than just that. I guess before I get to this sand and this weight of this car, I'll say that inertia, well, Newton's first law is sometimes called the law of inertia. Newton's first law is sometimes called the law of inertia. Measuring inertia is a little bit like measuring mass. Think of this. If you have this bucket and this bucket, one of them is filled with sand. It has more mass. It is going to be more resistant to move than this one. Here you can push this and it'll go round and round and round and round and round. You'll have to do something to push this one to go round and round. So weight has something to do with inertia. The heavier something is, the more it resists change. What about this picture? This fella or lady here says this little car has less inertia than a big truck. Why? Because the big truck has more mass. The big truck has more mass. And the more mass something has, the more resistant it is to move. And the more resistant it is to stop. If I were driving this little bitty vehicle, don't even know if I could fit in it, but if I were driving this little bitty vehicle and I had to stop quickly, I could stop quicker than a big truck. Slammed on the brakes, this will stop quicker because it has less mass. So measuring inertia, believe it or not, is a little bit like measuring mass. I think I just have one more photo here. Inertia is why we wear seat belts, like this guy is right here. You have the constant speed of the moving car. Quick deceleration is an unbalanced force. So as a result, the unbalanced force makes the guy move forward into his seat belt. You also have a force on the friction of the seat. It doesn't want to let him move. The rider moves forward after the car is stopped because of inertia, and the seat belt stops the rider who is still going at constant speed. If you have a quick stop, this seat belt then acts as an unbalanced force in which to stop him. Hey, I hope you've learned a little bit about forces.